Hey everybody, I just watched Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, and I wanted to give my thoughts and opinions on the movie as someone who enjoys Dungeons & Dragons on the tabletop, and also as an enjoyer of films in general. And I'll speak in broad terms in order to avoid spoilers. I came into the theater with relatively moderate expectations, and from the trailers that I saw, it definitely seemed like one of those okay movies that you kind of laughed at and then forgot about once you left theaters. Sort of like the average Marvel movie, except with a fantasy texture layered on top. However, I would say that as I left the cinema, I was honestly pleasantly surprised. I felt that my expectations were somewhat surpassed, and that Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves was a genuinely solid movie all around. I don't think it's a mind-blowing, must-see experience, but it had heart, it had charm, and it felt like a classic hero's journey of a father who was not there for his daughter, who could not let go of his dead wife, leading to dire consequences, wrapped in a lot of satirical but still endearing tongue-in-cheek style humor that I think works really well with audiences that have never really played the tabletop game, while also still making the players of D&D smile here and there. One example of humor that I felt was very cleverly written in a way that is satisfying to both D&D players and the average moviegoer would be the part when they first entered the Underdark and encountered a strange brain monster with arms and legs, known as an intellect devourer. The paladin of the group explains that it likes eating the brains of intelligent people, and a few seconds later, the brain monster passes by all of the heroes, seemingly unimpressed by their intellect, with Chris Pine's character stating that he felt hurt. This works well in multiple ways, as it sets up a quick gag for people who don't know anything about Dungeons & Dragons, other than the fact that the main characters are not the brightest bunch, so it makes sense that a brain monster who likes eating brains won't care much for them. But it also was a nod to the fact that the main cast consists of a paladin, bard, sorcerer, barbarian, and druid. To someone who has never played D&D, that probably means nothing, but to D&D players, it's funnier because it's a reference to the fact that none of those classes uses their intelligence ability score for anything important, which is why it's often considered a dump stat for those players, and their intelligence modifiers are usually in the negatives. And this careful balance between being funny for the general audiences while also having references to the actual tabletop game and their mechanics was pretty well maintained throughout the 2-hour-long movie, and personally I think it served the film very well. I thought that the comedy aspect would be the biggest pain point for me personally, but while watching it in the theaters, some of the jokes actually got chuckles out of me. I felt that the humor was decently written and was always in a very lighthearted manner. It never felt super intrusive, and it never felt damaging to the story that it was trying to tell. The movie never really took itself that seriously, but it still was able to walk a very fine line where the investment to the characters and plotline was never lost. There was still mounting tension being carried from scene to scene, and the humor never got in the way of the more serious parts where there was actual character development happening, and the more tender scenes that helped reaffirm the bonds and values that the main characters possessed, and the challenges that each of them need to overcome. One thing that I was also quite happy with was the way that the nature of the comedy was handled. The humor all felt very good-natured. The banter and wit never felt mean or condescending to its source material or the players of D&D. And all of the characters had their moments to shine, with each of them covering for each other's weaknesses. They were stronger than the sum of their parts when working together as a team, which was really nice to see. There were also other elements of the film that I felt that the trailers did a disservice to, such as the combat sequences. I did not expect such fast-paced choreography that actually felt intense and well practiced. The fight scenes in general were pretty great, had a good rhythm, and visually looked quite nice, while still being able to tell what was actually going on. It never descended into a CGI blobfest where you couldn't tell who was fighting who, or what kind of powers each of them were using. Everything was very readable. I was also surprised that Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves received a PG-13 rating. There were some pretty gruesome scenes with people's heads getting chopped off or turning into the undead. There was also a little bit of blood in a few scenes and a little bit of swearing just for good measure as well. However, despite my belief that the trailers and marketing material for the film was perhaps more of a hindrance than a boon, I would say that I can kind of see why it was tricky to advertise. The movie is over 2 hours long, and it tries to do a lot. It tries to establish a basic understanding of the lore-rich world of the Forgotten Realms. It tries to present and explain the individual backstories of the main cast, all of whom have different abilities and powers, while also fitting all of that into a fantasy heist gone wrong, mixed with betrayal, adding in a father trying to make amends with his estranged daughter, and culminating into stopping an evil necromancer from killing everybody in the city as a climax. And this is actually perhaps the film's greatest strength. The overall pacing and flow of the movie was very punchy and had a very well-timed cadence to all of the different elements, allowing them to juggle the contrasting scenes in a coherent fashion. And what I mean is that the film never dwelled too long on any particular joke, it never dragged out an unnecessary scene. All of the prep work actually does come into play later on in the movie. The general dynamics of the film were also fairly straightforward. The bad guys had easily understood motivations, which is to kill everyone and then turn them into an undead army, and the good guys had sufficient time allocated to their character, goals, and backstory, giving each of them a proper setup and a logical payoff. Basically, nothing in the plot was particularly convoluted, at least for me, even though there was a variety of spells, magical items, and special abilities that were on display. The film made sure to give enough breathing space for all of the mechanisms to be briskly but accurately explained so that you can actually understand when they use them. Things being kept simple and straightforward may not be considered high praise, but I would say that the movie's simplicity absolutely played in its favor and helped the audience keep up with everything that was going on. I would rather have something that is basic and simple than complex and convoluted when it comes to a movie like this. Another element that was baked into Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves that I found to be pleasantly surprising as a D&D player was actually the attention to certain mechanical details that were weaved naturally into the overall storytelling. Things like the portal making hither-thither staff having a maximum range and requiring people to actually see the spot they are targeting. The Paladin wanting to tell people about his Oath of the Ancients, which is a subclass from Player's Handbook. The Red Wizard of Thay losing concentration on her Golem creation spell after getting hit with a slingshot. The Weak Sorcerer being unable to use Dispel Magic on the higher level Time Stop spell. Characters trying to prevent spellcasters from casting their spells by covering their mouths, preventing them from completing the verbal component of the spellcast, and also the subtle acknowledgement that they are living in a world where clerics can actually bring people back from the dead, and so in order to generate conflict from having lost loved ones, they sensibly gave the bad guys weapons that specifically prevented resurrection by regular means. Essentially, the scriptwriters did at least some of their homework on D&D world building, which is very heartwarming to see. There are, of course, some creative liberties being taken here and there, and that's to be expected, but things like the druid being able to wild shape into an owlbear, and also being able to wild shape like 5 times in a few seconds. But overall, I was impressed with how faithfully they adapted the rules and mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, while also still being a fast-paced action comedy. There are a few more things that I wanted to talk about, but this is bordering on nitpicky spoiler territory, so feel free to skip to the conclusion timestamp on the video if you want absolutely zero spoilers. Throughout the movie, I was actually kind of waiting for Edgin the Bard to actually cast magic. If you don't know, bards are actually quite good with arcane magic in the game, and they're able to cast pretty powerful spells using their instrument and performative abilities. But unfortunately, Edgin never casted a single spell throughout the entire movie. He kind of just bashed people over the head with his lute, although his lute did seem to be reinforced with some kind of leather on the backside so that it wouldn't break in combat. So there was attention being paid there. But I do understand that they didn't want to tread on the toes of Simon the Sorcerer because, casting magic was his whole thing, in the same way that Doric the Druid never used her nature magic except for wild shape. And in some ways, I guess it was smart that the script writers decided to try and draw a much stronger dividing line between the strengths and weaknesses of the characters. I think it does make a lot more sense for the people that, don't know D&D, and to get a better sense of the individual superpowers and archetypes that each character represented. But still struck me as a D&D player as a little odd that the bard didn't cast, any spells because the movie was so good at adapting so many other D&D mechanics into the film. Although Edgin did inspire his party members to be better at one point on the beach, so I guess that was good overall. And I suppose the other nitpick that I wanted to talk about was the backstory for Saz Tem, Thay, and the Red Wizards. In Honor Among Thieves, it was shown that Saz Tem basically massacred the Zulkirs and the people of Thay and turned them into his undead slaves. This does make sense for the purposes of the movie, him being the big bad evil guy and setting up the Red Wizard's master plan for the people of Neverwinter. But it does deviate somewhat from my understanding of how Thay actually works. While I'm not 100% sure on the lore of Thay, I'm fairly confident that Saz Tem and the Red Wizards don't actually go around killing their own people within their capital city of Thay. Instead, in the lore, they go around conquering other kingdoms and nations in a cycle of never-ending war in order to fuel their ever-growing undead army, while also maintaining a stable economy and a source of people that they can recruit into the ranks of wizards, assassins, and spies. That's how Thayan society works. Saz Tem's ultimate goal is to ascend to godhood, and in order to do that, he needs worshippers, so wiping out your own population is somewhat counterproductive to that goal. But again, for the purposes of the movie, it does work well enough. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that it was kind of funny that the Red Wizard of Thay would have probably won if they just simply closed the gates or locked the doors to the Colosseum at the end and prevented their victims from escaping, but oh well. So in conclusion, I felt that Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves was a pleasant surprise that surpassed my initial skepticism and tepid expectations. It is by no means a decade-defining piece of cinema, but it was a very fun film and a very solid movie that was able to stay relatively true to its roots, struck a very cheerful tone that never devolved into making fun of everything under the sun and turning everything into one big joke. It instead had a finely tuned atmosphere that I feel is missing from other big-budget movies. Its approach to humor was well balanced and allowed for a decent amount of character development for the main character and allowed for character arcs to be properly set up, supported, and have satisfying payoffs. I enjoyed watching Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, as both a D&D fan and a casual movie watcher. I felt that it had enough for both sides of the coin, with a tight script packed with visually attractive scenes and lighthearted humor that the average person can get behind, while also having quite a few winks and nods to the D&D fanbase that made me grin. I hope you guys like this movie review video. It's definitely a different type of video than the ones I usually make, but I wanted to try something new. And as always, I hope that anyone who watches my stuff enjoys what I create as much as I enjoyed creating it in the first place. I'll see you guys next time, but until then, goodbye for now.